Hey, I think I'm recording. Hey, everyone, it's Sleepy Vlog 79. And once again, I'm going to be responding to lots of the comments from the previous Sleepy Vlog, which in my mind were just that the comments, especially questions or media comments, had slowed down. But I neglected to realize I'd made a three-part video, a three-part Sleepy Vlog. So there are actually a lot of comments there that are of great interest to me. So we'll see how long all of this takes me. I had a bunch of other vlogish things I wanted to say. Kind of the the highlight, although it's a low light, was my discovery of how Robert Crumb is on the outs. Robert Crumb, for those who might not know, I assume most people do know, but the most famous of the 60s, early 70s underground comics creators, creator of Mr. Natural and Fritz the Cat and many other things. And I saw some things online about people saying angry things about Robert Crumb. And then I heard the podcast for the comic book podcast for Publishers Weekly, which does run to the politically correct side. So they were reporting on this thing, and they were very sympathetic with it, which is that at the SPX, which I guess is the big indie comics convention or conference, at the awards banquet, I hope I have this right, one of the leading current cartoonists, said something about how we don't need Robert Crumb anymore. And apparently twice during his speech, Robert Crumb was roundly booed by the entire audience, or a large enough part of the audience that it felt like the entire audience. And I looked up some more stuff about this online, and I guess there generally is a movement to unseat Robert Crumb in some way, or to say we don't like him, we don't approve of him, basically coming down to his treatment of women and his treatment of minorities. He has a few famous, very racist comics, which you could read as a confessional of a white man's racism, or a spoof of a white man's racism, or as being racist. And there's definitely lots of creepy sexual stuff, and even in Crumb's own movie, there was a documentary about Crumb, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But even in that, he admits basically he hates women, or he's really, really angry at women, and he expresses that in his comics. To me, that, as a male, I always viewed that as a legitimate expression. But when I read some of these articles where they're talking about, all the Crumb imitators and the gross things they did, raping women while punching them in the face and comics like that, or shooting them in the vagina while forcing them to give you a oral sex. It definitely, it's understandable from when you read it described that way, that maybe the current people who are doing independent very sort of undergroundish, the thing that replaced underground comics, which I guess we call independent comics, but it's more independent than indie comics at the comic book store, because you don't see these things at most comic book stores. So it's not like Image Comics or anything like that. I think at the most professional level, you might have Fantagraphics Comics, who ironically publish Robert Crumb books. But so there was another kind of thing in Boston. I'm not sure what it is. Some kind of comics gathering. Maybe it's a yearly thing, or maybe it's more often, that had different rooms. And one was named the Eisner Room, and one was named the Crumb Room, and one was named I forget, a famous woman, current indie comic creator of Funhouse. I have never read it, so maybe that's why I'm not remembering her name. But they decided to retire the Crumb Room. And so I think some of this talk is about, does Crumb deserve a place in history because of what he represents? Or Other people are just saying, I personally don't like Crumb, and so I don't really want to revere him. None of us can control anyone's place in history in the long run, or I don't think they can. We'll see. But, if I live another 50 years, will Robert Crumb be erased from the memory of great comic book creators? I certainly like Robert Crumb. I always, before the movie Crumb, I viewed him as one of a number of leading underground comics creators. And I sort of viewed his most famous work as not being the most controversial stuff, more the Mr. Natural, that famous picture about America changing over the years, some other things like that. I definitely had a sense of him being far to the extreme of disliking women, or exposing his id of the nerdy loser who women don't like. And why should the nerdy loser who women don't like women, really? But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So at first I was kind of like pissed off, and then I thought, well, whatever they want, whatever these people want to do, it's kind of if you're saying that there's a field where political correctness is demanded, I guess maybe it is in these ultra indie underground kind of comics or literary kind of comics. Stuff that none of us in this comic book community almost never discuss. I would like to think you can love Robert Crumb and hate Robert Crumb at the same time, and you don't need to erase him from history. That would be my ideal. Just like you can love Pablo Picasso's art, but not love Pablo Picasso the man, or you may not at all agree with the kind of religious views that are expressed by Hieronymus Bosch, but still be amazed by his artwork and his visions and his daring for the kind of thing he was doing. Anyway, that's my feeling on it. But for a while, I was kind of depressed by that, I guess, as an old guy thinking about new generations who want to redefine everything and erase certain things, and that's probably always happened. It's just kind of in the modern day. As an old geezer, I could easily not have ever heard of that, especially if it weren't for the internet. I'd have no idea what they were doing at SPF and what a few hundred extreme indie comics creators think about Robert Crumb. So yeah, that, and then another thing, I got this in one of my recent in-stock trade hauls. It's called the World's Greatest Comics Magazine, and it takes place between, it's 12 issues they published, I think sometime in the early 2000s or late 90s. 12 issues that is a story that takes place between Fantastic Four number 100 and Fantastic Four number 101. I think 101 is the last issue that Jack Kirby drew. Stan Lee stayed on writing it a while longer. So it has an amalgam of many artists all doing their best Kirby imitation. And I think its overall is plotted by Eric Larson and Eric Stevenson, who is now the publisher at Image. I don't know if this had something to do with Image all along, but then it has people like Bruce Timm, Keith Giffen, George Lucas, Eric Larson. These are people drawing. Eric Schanauer, Ron Frenz, Tom Scioli, Keith Giffen, Bruce Timm. So, and every issue is drawn by multiple artists, and you don't get credited. You don't get credits in the issues themselves. There's on the contents page, but so everyone is a bit anonymous in their Kirbiness. And I was flipping through it, and I was so excited, and I started reading it, and I didn't get through the first issue yet. I put it down and read something else. And it makes me feel like, made me think my nostalgia for old comics has a lot to do with the art and a lot less to do with the writing. When people are imitating the writing style from back then, obviously it's not nearly as wordy as the old Stan Lee style comics. But still, the kind of plot and writing and their attempt at doing the pacing just didn't work that much for me. And at the same time, I just read 10 issues of Jim Starlin's first 10 issues, mostly Captain Marvel with a little bit of Iron Man, covering, excuse me, fiddling with my computer, covering Jim Starlin's first presentation of Thanos. And parts of it were really good to read, and other parts of it were like spinning your wheels around and around in a circle. So again, this is something I have huge nostalgia for, but rereading it, I realized it was way less well written than I thought. Especially, it's just not meant to be read as a 10-issue story. Even though it's a continuing story, I know I, as a kid, might have read 3 or 4 of those 10 issues, and I was filling in an amazing story in my head that went between the issues I hadn't read. But when you put it all together, there's not as much there, and the dots are not connected that well. The art was beautiful, and Jim Starlin's art got better and better and better. So I'm kind of in this weird phase of feeling weird about my nostalgia, because I've also been buying a lot of late silver and early bronze comics lately. Hang on a second. I have, for instance, been working on this stack of Submariner comics, which were comics that I sometimes saw on the newsstand, I think, but I only could buy so many comics, so I never bought more than 1 or 2 Submariner comics back in the day as a kid. So now I've just bought a ton of them, and I love the covers, and I have a dread feeling that reading several in a row might be painful. Maybe what I should do is like read 1 a month. So some of these I've shown before. They're all slipping out of my hands, but just so fun when I look at the covers, and so bring out so much the nostalgia, that nostalgic feeling in me. But I think there was good writing in the Silver and Bronze Age, but there's plenty of stuff that only partially works too. Excuse me. And if you go back and just read something you thought you loved as a kid, it can be a bit tricky. Speaking of that, actually, I bought the newly released reprint of this Dracula Lives Omnibus, Volume 1. I hope they come out with 2 and 3. So these went out of print right around the time I realized that someone had stolen my box of Dracula 1 through 70 that I had hoarded in the 80s with the intention of reading them all in a row. Because as a kid in the 70s, I read bits and pieces of them, but not all of them in a row. So that might not work. Although I've read a lot of them in a row, and they start out kind of weak before Marv Wolfman gets on them and gets stronger and stronger as they go, from what I can remember. Maybe I did read those 70 ones in a row, maybe around 1990 or something. The other thing is, people talk about money and how much comics cost. This has 36 issues in it. And because I bought it the week it came out on In-Stock Trades, I got it for half price. Now I guess it would be 42% off, but it was 50% off the first week. So that's $50. So that's less than $2 per issue in current money. I think when I did the calculate, it's probably like $1.60 per issue or something like that. So reading comics can be quite inexpensive, along with all the $1 boxes and the 50-cent boxes and stuff like that. And yet it can also be very expensive. So let me dive back into comments from Sleepy Vlog 78. One of the things that I was responding to is Celia from Norway/Paris, who asked about, how to get into Marvel and DC Comics and what were good starting places. And I thought you should find those individual pieces, like All-Star Superman or whatever, that are kind of standouts that a lot of people recommend, rather than trying to read long continuities. And an interesting thing, every year DC releases this DC Essential graphic novels, and it's free at comic book stores, at least in the US, but you can probably get a digital version of it on Comixology for free also, and maybe in other places. And it would be a good resource for someone who wants to try out some DC but isn't sure where to start. Now, not everything in here, I would pick the things that have been around a while, like Hush would be good. Actually, Batman White Knight is not bad either, but some of the things in here are just their latest comics, but others are definitely things that are classics, like Batman Year One. If you're curious about Batman, definitely read Batman Year One. If you've never read any Wonder Woman and you want a pretty mature version of Wonder Woman, the Brian Azzarello Cliff Chang series of Wonder Woman from the New 52 is highly worth reading. Not good for Wonder Woman purists who don't want her to have anything to do with Zeus. But so this is something, a good resource. I don't know I think maybe Marvel sometimes does something like this too. I'm trying to remember. But DC puts this out every year. So that's a good resource. And so some other people chimed in the comments for Celia or for anyone else wanting to look into Marvel and DC who haven't found good entry points. So Max Washington suggested the Wonder Woman trade by Brian Azzarello. The Wonder Woman series. It's a series of trades. Silver Surfer by Dan Slott, he recommends. That's Dan Slott and Michael Allred, which I think, what was that, about 15 or 20 issues? So a few trades. That's really good. Superior Spider-Man by Slott, Max also recommends. Hulk Gray by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. Daredevil Yellow by Loeb and Sale. He recommends the Gwen Stacey saga in Superman. I don't know if they've printed a trade called the Gwen Stacey saga or if you have to piece that together. The Dark Phoenix saga from X-Men. That's a very good one. It's pretty lengthy and it has a lot of that over wordiness of the Bronze Age. But if you can put up with that, that's good. Frank Miller's Daredevil, I absolutely agree with that. And that's to me where comics were ushered out of the Bronze Age, in Frank Miller's Daredevil. You can find various trades if you see Frank Miller and Daredevil together. But I would start with the oldest ones numerically. Gregor Black suggested a lot of DC Rebirth as a great jumping on point for DC. And he thinks the current stuff coming out from Marvel, like Amazing Spider-Man, Captain America, Avengers, and Fantastic Four, is mostly really good. And all of those, I guess, have started up again recently. So if you can figure out, like if you're buying trades, I imagine the first Amazing Spider-Man trade by Nick Spencer is soon to come out, or the first Captain America by Ta-Nehisi Coates, or I would go back to the Mark Waid Captain America perhaps. Avengers, I'm not sure who's writing, but all these things have started up recently. Or if you have access to a comic book store, you still might be able to get all the issues going back to number one and all those. So that's interesting stuff. Recommendations from Gregor. Robert Ahmed said, for the person trying to get into comics, I recommend The New Frontier by Darwyn Cooke. And that is one of the most excellent DC books to just pick up and just read that to get a kind of modern retro feeling for the DC characters. One of the great DC books, New Frontier by Darwyn Cooke. He says covers the beginnings of the Justice League. You can go into it not knowing anything about the characters and still enjoy it, and I agree. From Marvel, try Spider-Man Blue, Daredevil Yellow, Hulk Gray. So a lot of people vote for that. All done by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. So if I get around to it, I'll try to put that as a list in the description so that you can check it out as a resource, Celia or anyone else interested in that. So then, let's see, I'm doing okay, 20 minutes. Maybe I'll go a little bit longer. Maybe I'll just try to pack it all into one video this time and see how it goes. Some people actually got through my 50-minute video I did a while ago. So to those people, super big thumbs up. And of course, the great thing about YouTube is you can always come back and watch it in pieces. I do that with a lot of people's videos. So still generating a lot of good commentary about comic book shops and economics and the way the market is going, and will floppy survive and all that kind of stuff. I'll have to put in the description below a link to Spiro.geeks, our wonderful New Zealand friend, who made his own video responding to this whole idea about are the floppies dying? Is the direct market, the comic book shops dying? And he put out a lot of criticisms, and I think I would agree with just about everything he said. And I think one of his great points was probably to keep them alive in the long run, you need to go back to more one and done and shorter stories. I've kind of been thinking that a lot in the last few years. If you want to keep those individual stories, individual issues alive, and for new readers to pick up on them, and just people in general to be able to afford to get them. So Captain Strangelove commented along those general lines. I totally agree with you on the crossover overkill. Comics are no longer the inexpensive reading medium they once were, and forcing consumers to buy more to get a completed story really strains the budget. Yeah, so that's totally true on the crossovers. And sometimes a storyline goes on for 4 or 5 years really, and you have to, even if you're buying it in trades, you'd have to buy so many trades to get the full story. And that's only so many people are willing to spend their money that way. Marvel really flooded the market during that distributor collapse and flooded it. I think that's when the late 90s, I think the distributor collapsed. Marvel really flooded. This is still Captain Strangelove talking. Hans. Marvel really flooded the market during the distributor collapse and flooded it with rubbish, in my opinion. What do you think will be going to happen when comics price up to $4.99? We both know that base price point is on the horizon. Yeah, boy, is it. Especially, Marvel's going to be there first, I bet, and everyone else will eventually follow, just as Marvel was the first one to make everything $3.99 or higher. I'm always concerned that comic collecting will become an elitist hobby. And yeah, I get that feeling too. Those of us who buy a good chunk of new comics every week, we have to make a pretty good living or be idiots to spend that much of our income. So I think it already is kind of an elitist. On the flip side is when some of the trades where you can get a good deal, if you know that you want that chunk, especially for the old comics like that Dracula thing I showed. Really, those omnibuses are great deals. If you can afford that chunk of money up front, you're getting a lot of comics for it. The other thing is the $1 boxes. If it's almost like a class system. The people with a lot of money can buy brand new comics, and if they're devoted enough to them, and other people with less money can dig through boxes or order cheap trades online. And I don't know what to think about that. But one of the great things about comics is it is not an elitist medium, at least in the United States. And I think in many parts of the world. So it's something that people from all walks of life can share and enjoy. So I hope it does not become too elitist. Edward2962 said, I would bet part of the reason the big two don't go digital only or digital first is that the non-returnable aspect of the brick and mortar stores is easy guaranteed profits. I agree with what you say about Marvel management squeezing the market before it collapses. So it's not too hard to sell on a non-returnable basis. It's not too painful for the companies doing it. Of course, digital is kind of the same way. There's only profit. There's no expenses like returned books either. But until you don't, why not do the physical market even if it's a smaller percentage than digital? And supposedly right now it's a bigger percentage. So he adds kind of a dig at me, or just having, I don't think he's not pro Comicsgate, but anyway, he says, believe it or not, Richard Meyer, but I think he's teasing me. Believe it or not, Richard Meyer said something similar in one of his old videos. LOL. I'm not surprised. I can't watch all of Richard Meyer Diversity in Comics videos because he puts out 2 a day, and I can watch maybe 1 a month. But I've certainly heard him say things that I agreed with, along with lots of other things that I thought were twisting the facts to fit his theory. But my only real objection to Diversity in Comics is the way he insults individual people. I think you can have any opinion you want about comics, but I don't agree with attacking individuals, punching below the belt often, and that's why people are in the comics community, of the professional comics community, are so against him, which he manages to turn to his advantage in a way by saying they're against his politics, which they may or may not be, whatever his politics are. 64-page special said, and I'd say the speculator market has a bunch of mini pops, 1 or 2 hot books plummet instead of the whole market. So there's always another book to chase. So that's kind of 64-page special's explanation as to why we don't get a huge speculator bubble bursting and leading to another huge fall in the comic book market. And that makes sense to me. I don't know if it's true or not. I really, we're all like observers, like touching the elephant from different directions and trying to figure out what's going on. Someone who has a much bigger picture of at least more parts of the elephant is Jared Osborne, because he used to work for, I can't remember how long, a decade, I think, for Marvel Comics in the production department. So Jared says, all Marvel's, this is responding to my theorizing that Marvel is purposefully squeezing the market dry for as much money as it can get, knowing that they're going to kill it or that it's going to die. Jared says, all of Marvel's squeezing and killing of the market does come from Ike Perlmutter, who is the person who, in essence, owns Marvel or sold it to Disney, but now owns a lot of Disney. I'm not sure how all that works. That's the culture he set up at Marvel over the years. If you weren't on board, you were eventually let go. I have no idea how Disney's buying of Marvel affected that culture, but as far as I know, Ike is still the guy in charge of Marvel, which is also the impression I get. He's no longer in charge of the Marvel movies, but still in publishing. And I don't think it's a long-term plan. It's more along the lines of how much money can we make today? And I answered, makes sense. Funny how I tend to imagine a master plan by some misguided business school graduate. And Jared Osborne, maybe because I've known some misguided business school graduates in my day. Jared Osborne added, it's more like people get rewarded for a series of small, almost unrelated plans that make money. And when those plans are looked at from afar, give the impression that there is some sort of master plan. But there really isn't. Besides, where can we make some easy money? So, that's really good to know. And, no doubt is the best analysis we're going to get. Paulo Costa put in his... So I had mentioned on Twitter, as a kind of starting point of some point I wanted to make, about him mentioning on Twitter about 50 shops closing this year. And I, didn't remember the context of how he said that or what his spin on it was. But anyway, At the time, I thought it was supposed to be evidence that the comic shops were dying. Paulo says, if my comment about 50 comic shops was on Twitter, I was probably responding to Perch, who is a comic shop owner. If I remember correctly, I was mentioning 50 shops closing isn't a high number and isn't very significant. But there are other situations that might be symptoms of a creeping illness, and depending on toy sales is one. So someone else in some other comments had mentioned their shop stopped selling comics and just was selling toys. I still believe the floppy has worn out its welcome, and with you mentioning new people getting confused with pull lists, it might be a better idea to create product that new or occasional readers can pick up at any time and feel satisfied with, instead of trying to force them immediately to become regular readers with a commitment to coming back every Wednesday. And that's certainly true, and I think, well, DC in particular is working on that kind of stuff, and there's certainly lots of other comic book companies that, are less common in the comic book store that provide that kind of service in the book market, especially the younger kids' book market. But yeah, they should look more other ways to appeal to people in comic book stores than just the weekly, monthly product. Jeremy Klein wrote, my opinion may not be worth much since my pull list is never more than 2 or 3 items. But dollar comics are new to me, and so are $20 20 comics lots on eBay. I feel bad, but that is the way it is. So he feels bad that he can get comics so cheaply, but of course he's not going to feel that bad that he's not going to buy the cheap comics. I'm certainly the same way. I get all excited when I can find some really cool stuff that I used to think I'd never see that comic, and now I can get it for 50 cents sometimes. Second, due to economics, I will almost never buy trades or omnibus at the LCS. It's just too expensive for me. Used to be the only way available to me. And that's the same with me. I have a 25% discount at my shop, so I will buy some trades there, and ones that I know I can't. Certain things like Marvel and DC I can get very cheaply on in-stock trades, but other ones are close enough to that 25% discount that I'll buy them from my shop. But I certainly am not. I never bought hardcovers at all until I got these kinds of discounts. I'm certainly not going to buy a $100 book at a shop instead of getting it for $55 online or something. It's just the economics of that just don't make sense. Third, more creators are jumping into the Webtoons Korean fried ring. We've discussed Webtoons before. My daughter reads it a lot. Warren Ellis and Colleen Doran's finality is up now. Give me my 7 pages a week. So I guess that's Jeremy's calculation of how many pages. It's hard to tell on Webtoons how many pages you're reading because it all just keeps sliding up to get to the end of the episode. I responded to him, I've got to check that out. Wow. Wonder if Ellis can keep up the schedule. I often find in-stock trades to be cheaper than used bookstores. Yeah. And Jeremy answered, it works out to less than 10 pages a week, which is comparable to a floppy copy per month. Can't wait to see more creators make the transition. Getting a piece of story or art from a favorite creator every week somehow feels more intimate. Plus, they read the comments as well. So at the bottom of each episode in Webtoons, you can read all the comments by any reader who wants to leave comments. And often it's very fun to read their comments. And I guess the creators can reply, and often there are just notes to the audience at the end of the episode from the creators. Sometimes they show fan art that's been sent to them, that kind of thing. I do wonder with Webtoons, because it's free in the United States. I don't know if it's free in Korea, and how much, Jeremy, are you willing to pay for Webtoons once they start charging? So I don't know what other ways it's monetized by. I think the more successful people on Webtoons are paid by the company, and maybe there are a few ads on Webtoons, but somehow it's got to become more monetized. It's the number one source of comics in Korea, I believe, but they must monetize it more there. Daniel Clark, who I think is Dan, the comic book concierge, who's also on the Geekcast radio network. Dan says, I'm someone who was collecting solely digital for years and just went back to physical copies this year. Watching hauls and such caused the itch to return. I will say the one thing Marvel does that I wish everyone did was the free digital copy with every issue. As a digital reader, it just makes sense to get the physical copy as I'm paying the same. Right, that does make a lot of sense. And if you can get a discount on physical copies, you never get a discount on the digital until, years later, I think. Plus, I feel like I'm way more likely to reread a book if I have quick access to it digitally. And that's a good point, too, If I just want to flip quickly to a comic book that's in my boxes, if I also have it on my iPad instantly. So he's saying I would be more likely to reread the book if I have access to it digitally. That's, of course, assuming the same digital platforms stay around. And that is a big question. It's hard to imagine all of the digital platforms will be here in 20 years. Whether what you've bought there will transfer to someone else over time, I don't know. We'll see. For a while, DC was doing the digital copy too. I have a feeling that they just found not enough people were using it, so they figured it wasn't that big of a selling point. I remember Marvel dropping it and then people complaining, so they put it back. I wonder how expensive it is for them to maintain that system. Me personally, I always think, I should do the digital code thing with my comic just in case I want to read it digitally someday. But then I become too lazy and I don't, because I don't feel like peeling off the sticker and typing in the numbers. They should have an app that just reads a barcode and then it, like in the CLZ app. That would help. Or maybe they already have that and I don't even realize it. So because then with the Marvel comics, I get Marvel Unlimited. So 6 months later, if I want to read it digitally, it'll be there digitally anyway, and I can reread it that way. Assuming the Marvel Unlimited lasts forever or doesn't become so expensive that I don't want to pay for it. Right now, it's really cheap. So as all of this discussion has been percolating now for several weeks through my videos and in my head, I've decided I really do think we get an exaggerated idea of the demise of the comic book store because of the internet and too much information. Too many people citing certain facts but not having the whole picture. You can get just a distorted, it's human nature, but a distorted view of things from that. I basically assumed that right now comics sales stores are flat. They can go down a bit and comic stores will still survive. Comic stores have survived other collapses and contractions. Maybe it's because I hope they will survive, but I think as long as, they may not be the biggest force in the market, but they could still exist for people who love comics the most, and they're run by people who love comics, not people who are just trying to make money. As long as that's going on and the publishers see that it's still worth, selling those non-returnable physical copies along with all the digital copies, I think it can go on for a long time. I think we get the negative side gets overhyped because of the internet. So on to other kinds of questions. I guess this is just going to be a mega long video because I'm at 38 minutes now. Max Washington Songs asked, who is your favorite Orange Rocks on the Thing artist? Well, it has to be inked by Joe Sinnott. And it's either Jack Kirby or Rich Buckler, who was kind of my first Fantastic Four artist, although I kind of found Kirby reprints almost at the same time. And I felt like he did a really good job of doing what Kirby did with the block, with the chunky yellow rocks that make up the Thing, at least as good as Kirby, but sometimes I liked it even better, maybe. That's a bit I feel a bit sacrilegious saying that. Who are some artists who declined? I loved him Sale, but the last couple years of his stuff looks like he didn't finish it. He got really minimalistic, but I haven't followed Tim Sale that closely. I don't think I've seen too much of his recent work. Ditko's Spideys are staggering, but 15 years later, his Micronauts annual was so rushed looking. And yet, right up to his death, he also did some really cool stuff, like in that zine kind of things he published. Art-wise, it was really cool. The stories were kind of repetitive. So I think by the time of those the Micronauts annuals, and when he did ROM and some other things, he was definitely coasting and just putting in less work. He's definitely, that was a noticeable downhill slide, but he still had the talent as shown by the stuff he published for himself. I'm trying to think of other people who went downhill. Sad to say it, but John Buscema went downhill, I think, because he was just drawing too much, and he kind of formularized it, did it as a formula too much. Whereas Sal Buscema he did a lot of, he kind of evolved in a way that John Buscema didn't. But John Buscema started out brilliant, or very early in his career became very brilliant. But near the end, I thought he went downhill. There's so many artists probably who went downhill if I stop and think about it. But that's the first one that popped into my head. Jack Kirby went downhill a little, but there was still always some of the magic in there. And he went uphill first. His peak artwork was probably from age 40 to age 50 or 55 or something along those lines. And I don't know. Has Jim Lee recently started going downhill? Yeah, those are the ones I can think of right at the moment. And then Max says, I just read Fathom by Michael Turner. Are you a fan of Aspen Comics? I've bought a few Aspen comics out of the 50-cent bins, and I haven't read them yet. Some of them seem to have really nice coloring. I think they always have sexy women in them. Then he asked about Xenoscope. And have I read any Xenoscope? I don't think so. I don't object to sexy women in comics, but that's not something I collect for or look for, especially when it really leans into the masturbatory side of things. I'd rather masturbate over something else. Comics aren't my masturbation tool. Did you call in for Dial H for Heroes things? I wish I did. I didn't. I think I only ever read those when they were old and never was a current reader of Dial H for Hero. He did. Max did, and he says Harlan Ellison did too. Those bastards never used his great idea. And he can't remember what it was. Maybe it wasn't quite as great an idea as you thought. Did you call in for the Robin thing to kill Jason Todd or not? I think I did. I did not. I remember I knew about it, but I actually wasn't reading Batman at the time. And I was like, no way am I going to spend money to call in. Because what was it, like 50 cents or $1 to vote? Spider-Man, underarm webs or no? Underarm webs, definitely. I don't know why, but I always like those. If you were trapped in a well with spider ham, would you eat him? I'm not into raw pork, but if I could find a way to cook him, I would eat him. Robert Ahmad asked, I have to know why the dude did not like Will Eisner. The dude he's talking about is Howard Chaykin. And I guess Gil Kane did not like Eisner either. And it's interesting that Howard Chaykin got his start as kind of a apprentice of Gil Kane, working around his studio, getting him his coffee and stuff. So I don't know if that's why he didn't like Eisner. Kane and Eisner's personalities did not go off well. So basically, Howard Chaykin is saying that that Will Eisner was a jerk, an asshole, whatever else, but he's not specifying why. Maybe maybe Eisner was, who knows what he was like in person. I've certainly read lots of other people saying he was great and he was like a father figure, but they could be lying. I don't know. Ultimately, to me, it doesn't really matter if Eisner was a nice person or not. Russ Works wrote, I think Jack Kirby, wanted to maintain some more control by packaging his books on the West Coast to minimize the vandalism that DC committed under the guise of editorial expertise. He may have moved to the West Coast partially for that reason, even when he was still with Marvel, because he moved there beforehand. But he did become the writer-editor. He was technically the editor of his DC comics. Royer was out there, and I know that was part of it, that they could meet in person. And Royer was recommended to him by Alex Toth. Royer was out there so that Kirby could monitor him, and he not only was able to maintain Kirby's vision, he was also able to keep up with Kirby's phenomenal rate of production and even letter all the books. That is true. It is amazing that he was able to keep up with it, although even more amazing that Kirby could do all that. Kirby's penciling was so complete compared to his contemporaries, even laying in the black areas, that it seems like it would be a simple task to ink. But if you compare the results of other inkers throughout the era and earlier, Royer's work seems more of an achievement. So somehow Royer's talent, Mike Royer, who a lot of us consider the best Kirby inker, his talent seemed to be to translate Kirby's pencils into their best possible Kirby-ishness. He didn't add on a separate style, and he also didn't erase stuff. He put it all in. So he was able to work fast and channel accurately what he saw in the pencils without slowing down, and put in the lettering. I do think he eventually got tired out, and that's why, what was it, Bruce D. Patterson was brought in, or someone, I can't remember who, like that. So Gregor Black, who we heard from earlier, also asks for your thoughts on Alterna Comics. They're $1.50 standard cover price. So I love the $1.50 cover price. I love the cheaper paper they're printed on. I have now read about 4 different Alterna series, and only one of them was close to what I felt like was a satisfying professional comic. It was very good, and it was worth $1.50, but some of the other ones definitely felt almost like what I would call semi-pro work. But I wish my stores stocked more of them. If I don't pre-order them, they're not going to get them at my stores. So I wish I could go to a store that has all the alternate ones and flip through them. So I think it's a great idea. I think they don't pay up front. I think they just share the profits, if there are any, with the authors. So it is kind of a not entirely professional kind of publishing venture. I'm not sure. And yeah, that's all I really know about them. But I would buy more if I could just pick them up, like I said, rather than having to commit to them in advance without seeing them. So I hope they... and I should look for some trades, because some people have talked about some that sounded interesting. My favorite one was called Doppelganger, which had horrible, horrible covers, but otherwise was pretty good. 64-page special asked a question: how were the Tomorrow's mags on the flight? I had showed a bunch of Tomorrow's magazines that I got recently, and I brought 3 or 4 of them on my flight to visit my mom. I found back issue to be too fluffy, but maybe the fluffier the better on a long flight, kind of like airplane pillows. Maybe. For some reason, I like back issue better than Alter Ego. What they usually do is kind of like summarize a run of comics and then intersperse quotes from the creators along the way. And that isn't like deep journalistic stuff, I suppose, but I actually find that really enjoyable. It gives me some insight into what was going on, reminds me of what was going on in comics that I read a long time ago, or ones that I missed. So yeah, I find that format pretty fun. I also like in the various Tomorrows things where they do straightforward interviews with people. There's something, though, about the way Alter Ego's done somehow doesn't work as well for me, but like comic book artist and now comic book creator and some other ones, or the Jack Kirby creator when they have interviews, I really enjoy those. So yeah, I guess I'm happy with the fluffiness of Tomorrows. Celia asked, I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts on the difference between comics and graphic novels at some point. For example, I'm currently reading Berlin by Lutz, and it says comic on the back, even though it feels more like a graphic novel reading it. So as I think we also mentioned in some other comments where we chatted together, it's a gray area. Is there really such a thing as graphic novels? Some people just say it's just another name for comic books when they're in book form. So someone might just call this a graphic novel. They certainly put it in the graphic novel section of my library, if I got it from the library. But they don't. But these certainly count as comics in the sense that they were not written to be collected. So I personally would say if something was written to be read all at once, even if it was serialized first, that's a graphic novel. And if something was really written to be serialized and read once a month and kind of is an odd read if you try to read it all together, then that's a comic book, I guess. But really, it's all graphic novels are comics. Graphic novels are a subset of comics in terms of the way the word comic book is used in the United States. I presume in the English language in general. Comic books are, what's the right word? The name comic book is kind of a misnomer anyway, because when they first started, they were comic strips from the newspaper that they reprinted in a magazine or book-like format. So they called them comic books or funny books at first, because they often, in the United States anyway, called the newspaper comic strips the funnies. And so eventually, because there was no other name for it, even when they started doing original material, they just kept calling them comic books. So sequential art would be the overarching term, really, but it's too pretentious of a term for people to really use. But so anything that combines pictures and words organically rather than separating the two, I think is kind of a comic book or a graphic novel. But I think the term graphic novel started being used by various people in the 70s, and in the late 70s or early 80s was popularized by Will Eisner. And I think the idea then was, as opposed to serialized comics, it just came out as a book. But something like Jason Lutz, maybe he just prefers the term comic book. But also, it did appear as individual issues before it was collected. So maybe that's why he calls it a comic book. I haven't read it except for one or two individual issues, so I don't know if it reads like something serialized or if it more reads like one long piece. The Will Eisner books that first popularized the name graphic novel were actually collections of short stories. They were more like a series of Isaac Bashevis ghetto stories or something. But they were called graphic novels. So they're, because the idea was they were published all together in one volume. But even many of those were actually serialized in the Will Eisner Spirit magazine. So it's all just a mess. But if you wanted as I said, my definition would be if it reads like one piece, it's a graphic novel. If it reads like a lot of little interconnected episodes, then it's a comic book. Edward 2962 says, I think this is my last question. And it's kind of a joke question. When are you going to finally spill the beans on the great Portland comic book mafia that are using their great power to keep certain creators out of the comics industry? LOL. If you need to go into witness protection, I can help you go off the grid. Smiley face. So I live in Portland. I've lived here 28, 29 years. And Dark Horse Comics was already a thing when I moved here. It was one of the bigger, it was like the number 3 publisher, I think, back then. And the founder of Dark Horse had a comic book store here in Portland, and he opened up his offices here in Portland rather than moving to New York City, where all the other comic book publishers were back then. And over time, comic book people would be visiting Dark Horse and say, wow, Portland's a really cool place to live, and it's really cheap, which was very true in the 90s. My first rent here was $110 a month. And I lived in a group house in a mansion that had 4 living rooms and about 6 fireplaces. So it was an expensive group house. Anyway, Portland was super much the slacker town, lots of artists and everything. So comic book people moved here. And I would say politically, Portland at the time was just for quirky people, not for leftist people, but maybe more of those people are on the left. In general, I think the Oregon ethos is to support the idea of the individualistic person, which is kind of the American West in general, but very true of Oregon. So the cheapness, the quirky artistic community that had evolved in the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, and the fact that a fairly major publisher was here started attracting people, and then it snowballed, and now there's large studios where like 15 or 20 artists share some large studio space, and there's lots of writers and artists here, and I see Brian Michael Bendis biking around town. I used to go to the comic book store that Kurt Busiek went to, and I've noticed I don't usually pay any attention, so I'm sure I've been in the comic book stores with lots of the pros that live around here. There may be, so they've been accused by, I guess, basically by Richard Meyer of Diversity in Comics of being a Portland comic book mafia. I would guess that there's a bunch of different cliques. One has if I didn't hear about it on YouTube, I would have no sense of anything like that going on here. I used to notice, I haven't seen it lately, but there used to be signs around a lot for, you get together at a bar and you draw together, and I think that was a comic book thing. So I think it's, just because there's so many people here, there's obviously a strong social world of comics artists and such. But I have a feeling that that there are people of all different stripes and ages and types who moved to Portland over the years. Now, maybe a greater number of the people moving now are of the far left. I don't know, because Portland's gotten this distorted reputation. But I don't know. I have no idea if that's true. I'm answering this far too seriously. You certainly don't get a sense when you see Kurt Busiek in a comic book store that he's part of any kind of comic book mafia. He looks like your average aging, graying, overweight comic book fan. And, if you talk to him, he makes the same kind of jokes I've always heard those kind of comic book fans make. Not that I've talked to him a lot, but at one point I was kind of forced by the comic book store owner to, because I was buying 2 of his comic books right as he was there, talk with him. To me, it was quite awkward. And Vincenzo C. replied to the thread on Edward's comment saying, people really are being kept out by leftist creators. just like a lot of other jobs. So is that true? I don't know. Networking and social ability is part of all creative jobs, and that's why it's not the reason why I failed to be a creative person, but it's certainly one of the things that's kind of kept me out of that. I'm not good at networking, whatever my politics are. I would guess, again, to take this seriously, that there's probably is a certain leftist clique, and with those people, it might be hard to get work if it's clear that you're on the right. But I would think there's also a lot of people who never even think about the politics and are just thinking about comic books. Until recently, when they're being attacked on Twitter and told they're on the far left, and now they may be thinking about it more. So anyway, yeah, I have no answers, no real knowledge on any of that. But I just think it's all overblown by the way people talk on the internet. Okay, this may be my longest video ever, an hour, except for live videos. I'm going to post it anyway because I don't know how to split it in two easily.